She was 17 years old, standing in a pile of dust and busted brick, and every man on that job site thought she'd lost her mind. That's where this story starts. Not with a silo, with a cotton mill, a 100-year-old textile mill in the Piedmont of South Carolina, coming down board by board in the summer heat of 1978, and a girl named Josephine Calloway, everybody called her Jo, standing at the edge of the wreckage asking the demolition foreman for something he was about to burn. Her father ran a small trucking outfit out of the town of Calder's Mill. Her mother had passed 2 years before. Jo had grown up doing the books for her father's business in the evenings, learning early that the difference between a family that made it and a family that didn't. Luck. It was what you noticed that other people walked right past. Her father used to say that money doesn't disappear all at once. It leaks out through 100 small decisions nobody bothers to think twice about, and the only defense against that is paying attention. Jo had absorbed that lesson more completely than anyone expected from a girl her age. She wasn't the loudest person in a room. She wasn't the one who spoke first. She was the one who watched, who stood back long enough to understand a situation before she ever moved on it, the same patient, deliberate way her grandfather had watched things his whole life. He'd been gone 3 years by then, but she still carried around things he'd told her, the way you carry around a voice that stuck with you. The mill had been the heart of that town for a century. Calder Textile Company, built in 1874, spinning cotton into thread through to world wars and a depression, until the industry moved south to cheaper labor in the 50s, and the building sat empty for 6 years before the county finally condemned it. In the summer of 1978, they tore it down. What almost nobody in that town understood, what almost nobody thinks about when they watch an old mill come apart, is what a building like that is actually made of underneath the brick. The framing timbers in a 19th century southern cotton mill weren't ordinary lumber. They were heart pine, old-growth longleaf pine, cut from forests that don't exist in that form anymore. Trees that had grown slow and dense for 150 years before a saw ever touched them. The heartwood of that tree is saturated with natural resin, so dense it can dull a blade in a few passes. So hard it was once the material of choice for ship masts and railroad trestles because nothing else held up the same way under load. And this particular timber had spent 100 years doing something extra to itself. It had spent 100 years vibrating under the constant hum of spinning frames and power looms, drying out slow in the heat that mill floors held onto through every Carolina summer, tightening and hardening and darkening into a deep amber color that new-cut pine never gets, no matter how many years you let it sit and cure. It was a material that couldn't be replicated on purpose. It could only happen the way it had happened, by accident, over a century, inside a working building nobody ever intended as a lumber source. Jo didn't know all of that the day she walked up to the foreman. What she knew was what her grandfather had told her, 3 summers running, when they'd walk past that mill on the way to church on Sunday mornings. He used to slow down and look at it and say that building was sitting on wood. You couldn't buy any more at any price, because the trees it came from had been logged off a century ago, and the ones that grew back after weren't the same tree at all, faster growing, softer, thirstier for water, missing whatever it was that 150 patient years had put into the old ones. The foreman's name was Wade Pruitt, 36 years old, ran his own demolition and grading outfit of Spartanburg, drove a truck with his name painted across both doors in letters bigger than they strictly needed to be. He had a reputation around 3 counties for getting jobs done fast, and a temperament that didn't leave a lot of room for being told anything by anybody, least of all a teenage girl standing in the rubble in a pair of her father's old work boots to sizes too big for her. She asked if she could have the floor joists, not scrap lying loose around the site. She pointed specifically at the thick, dark timbers his crew had been pulling down all morning and stacking to burn in a pit behind the building. Pruitt looked at her for a second, like she'd asked him something in a language he didn't recognize. Then he laughed, loud enough that 2 of his men stopped what they were doing to see what was funny enough to interrupt the work. "Sweetheart," he said, wiping sweat off his forehead with the back of his glove. "That's 100 years of rat-chewed junk wood. Half of it's got nails buried an inch deep and the other half's rotten through. What in the world do you think you're going to do with it? She told him she was going to build a floor. That set him off again, harder this time. The kind of laugh that comes from a man who thinks he's just heard the most ridiculous thing all week and wants everybody around him to agree. He told her to go ahead and take whatever she wanted off the burn pile, since it was headed for ashes by Friday anyway, and it sure wasn't costing him a thing to let a girl haul off garbage, instead of him having to burn it himself. Then he turned around and walked back toward his crew, already halfway into telling the story before he was even out of earshot. Jo didn't say anything back. She'd learned that from her father. 2. You don't waste breath arguing with a man who's already made up his mind. You just go do the thing, quietly, and let the thing speak for you later, when he's not expecting to hear from it. Here's what nobody standing in that mill yard understood about Jo Calloway. She wasn't reacting on impulse. She hadn't woken up that morning and decided on a whim to go collect firewood. She had been circling this exact idea for the better part of a year, ever since the county first announced the demolition date, on a notice tacked up outside the courthouse. And she had spent that year doing something most 17-year-olds never think to do. She'd taken the bus into Greenville on Saturdays and sat in the public library reading everything she could find about old-growth southern pine, about what 100 years of heat, cycling, and resin saturation actually does to wood at a structural level, about how mill floors from that era had been laid in tight tongue-and-groove board, fitted so precisely you could barely slip a knife blade between the joints. Even after a century of foot traffic and vibration, her father had a half-acre lot behind their house that had never been good for much of anything, too rocky for a proper garden, too small and awkwardly shaped for anything the trucking business ever needed. He'd told Jo more than once, almost in passing, that if she ever wanted to build something back there, it was hers to try. Not as a promise exactly, more as a kind of quiet test, the way a parent sometimes hands a young person a hard, unglamorous piece of ground and then waits, without saying so, to see what they actually do with it. What Jo wanted to build was a small workshop. Not a house, not yet, not at 17. A 16-by-20 structure with a poured slab. A place she could use in the evenings for her father's bookkeeping. And if things worked out the way she'd been quietly hoping for months, a place to prove an idea she couldn't stop turning over in her head. Every time she walked past that mill, she had priced lumber at the yard in Calder's mill that spring, standing at the counter with a pencil and a scrap of paper doing the math twice to make sure she hadn't made a mistake. New pine flooring, at 1978 prices, would run her somewhere close to $400 just for the boards, before she'd even touched concrete, framing lumber, roofing, or a single nail. She had $91 saved up from 2 years of keeping her father's books on the side, $1 or $2 at a time. The math simply didn't work. It hadn't worked for months, no matter how she rearranged it. Then the mill came down, and the math changed completely, all at once, in the space of a single laughing conversation with a man who thought he was doing her a favor by letting her haul off his trash. She brought her father's flatbed out to the mill site that same afternoon, before Pruitt could change his mind or somebody else could get the same idea. 60-some-odd timbers came home with her that first trip, some split down the middle, a few scorched blacks on one end where an old fire had licked through part of the structure, decades earlier and never fully caught, but most of them sound clean through, heavy enough that she and her father together could barely wrestle each one onto the truck bed. She stacked them in the shade behind the barn, propped up on cinder blocks so air could move freely underneath, and the wood wouldn't sit trapping moisture against the ground. And for the next several weeks she did something that would have looked, to anybody watching from the road, like she wasn't doing anything at all. She studied the wood. Every evening after supper, while the light was still good, she walked around that stack of timber, running her hand slowly down the grain of one piece after another, turning boards over to compare the weathered outer face against the darker inner face, setting to pieces side by side to see how the old saw marks lined up between them. She pressed the tip of her pocket knife into the wood, at different points along the length of a timber, just to feel how much resistance she got compared to a scrap of ordinary pine from the lumber yard. and every single time the old would won. Decisively, the blade barely denting the surface, where it would have sunk half an inch into anything new. She was learning the material the slow way, the same way her grandfather had once told her to learn anything worth learning, completely, patiently, before you ever commit a single nail to it. What she figured out, over those weeks of quiet study, was this: the old mill timbers were too thick and too rough sawn to use whole as flooring, the way they'd come off the truck. But if she resawed them on her father's old table saw into flatter boards, roughly 3/4 of an inch thick, she'd expose the tight, dark heartwood grain that had been buried inside the timber the whole time. Grain so saturated with resin it practically caught the light once the saw opened it up. And if she face-nailed those boards down into a proper subfloor laid over a well-prepared slab, staggering every seam the way real millwork carpenters had done 100 years before her, she'd end up with a floor unlike anything a lumberyard in 1978 could sell her at any price on earth. Because nobody was growing trees like that anymore, and nobody could speed up 100 years of heat and resin and vibration no matter how much money they had to spend trying. She talked to her father about it on the porch one evening in April, laying it out for him the same careful way she'd laid it out in her own head for months. He listened all the way through without interrupting once. That was his way, always had been. And when she finally finished, he asked her exactly one question. He asked what the concrete was going to cost her. She told him. He was quiet a moment, then asked if the wood was really free. She said yes. He looked out at the dark for a while, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands, and then he said, "Then I suppose you'd better get started before somebody else comes back wanting that wood." Nobody came back for it, and in the first week of May 1978, Josephine Calloway started pouring her slab. She poured it with a rented mixer, a wheelbarrow, and her younger brother Ray, who agreed to help for 2 straight Saturdays, in exchange for Joe covering his chores for a full month afterward. A trade he'd come to regret bitterly the moment he found out exactly how much a bag of Portland cement weighs when you're hauling it by hand across a rocky, uneven half-acre lot in the thick June heat of upstate South Carolina. The ground worried her from the very start. Her half-acre sat low and drained poorly, and she'd seen firsthand what happened to a slab poured on unprepared ground. She'd watched a crack open up across her uncle's garage floor 2 summers before, widening a little more every winter, never once closing back up. So, she did exactly what she'd read about in an agricultural extension pamphlet she'd picked up at the county office months earlier. She dug down a full foot across the entire footprint of the building, packed 6 inches of crushed gravel firmly into the bottom, and let it sit and settle for a full week under a tarp before she poured a single bag of cement into the mixer. The clerk at the extension office, a careful older man named Curtis Boyd, told her honestly, without any unkindness in it, that he'd seen grown men with years of experience make a worse mess of a far simpler pour. She thanked him for the advice, went home, and did it anyway, exactly the way she'd planned. She poured the slab in 3 separate sections over 3 consecutive weekends, screeding each pour level by hand with a straight length of lumber dragged across the wet concrete, always working early before the worst heat of the day could set the mix to fast to finish properly. Her father came by on the second Saturday afternoon, stood quietly at the edge of the work for a long while without saying a single word, and then went back to check on his trucks. That was as close to praise as he ever came, and Joe understood exactly what it meant, without needing him to say it out loud. The flooring itself went down over 3 more weekends. In June, she'd resewn the salvaged mill timbers into rough boards over the preceding weeks, feeding them one at a time through her father's old table saw, careful and slow. And now she face-nailed them down into a plywood subfloor she'd already anchored securely to the cured slab, staggering every single seam the way the original mill carpenters had done a full century before her. Then she hand-sanded the entire surface, first with coarse paper to knock down the rough saw marks, then progressively finer grits after that, working to full days on her knees, until her fingers were raw and stinging, and finished it off with 3 careful coats of tung oil, rubbed into the wood by hand until it took on a deep, warm color that made people stop mid-sentence the moment they walked through the door. The first time she walked across that finished floor, in the last week of June, it didn't creak. It didn't give underfoot the way new wood sometimes does before it fully settles. It had a solid, dense feel that brand new flooring simply doesn't have, a feel that only comes from wood that's already spent 100 years being asked to hold real weight and never once failed at the job. Wade Pruitt drove past the Calloway place about a month later, hauling equipment out toward another job across the county line. He slowed down at the mailbox, looked at the little workshop sitting finished now on the rise behind the house, and kept right on driving. He didn't stop. He didn't say a word to anybody. Joe wasn't even outside to see the truck go by. The floor became something more than just a floor on a Sunday afternoon that August, when Joe's father hosted a small gathering after church, neighbors pitching in to help him get his equipment shed squared away before the start of harvest season. The kind of unhurried afternoon that always ended, like it did every time in Calder's mill, with sweet tea and pound cake out on the porch. A handful of the men wandered up the rise to see the little workshop Joe had built, mostly out of plain curiosity about what exactly a 17-year-old girl could have possibly managed to put together on her own with no crew and no experience. What they found stopped conversation cold. The floor ran wall to wall in deep amber board, the grain so tight and richly figured it looked less like ordinary lumber, and more like something you'd expect to find in a 100-year-old church pew, polished smooth by generations of hands. A woman named Ruth Alderman, who ran the general store in town and had a sharp eye for old, well-made things, crouched right down and ran her palm slowly across the surface, then looked up and asked Joe directly where in the world she'd gotten wood like this. When Joe told her the truth, straight from the old cotton mill, the one that had just come down that summer, Ruth went quiet for a moment. Then she said her own stockroom floor had been slowly rotting out for years now, and asked, plainly, if Joe would consider doing the very same thing for her. That was the real beginning of it. Word moved through a small town the way it always eventually does, slow and quiet at first, then all at once, spreading through church pews and store counters and porch conversations until it seemed like everybody knew the story at the same time. Over the following several years, Joe laid reclaimed heart pine floors in a dozen different buildings spread across 3 counties. Ruth's stockroom, a church fellowship hall, to old farmhouses, a small lawyer's office in the historic part of downtown Calder's Mill. She got steadily better at sourcing the wood as she went, learning to spot which local demolitions were sitting on genuine old-growth timber, worth the effort of saving, and slowly building relationships with contractors around the area who started calling her. Before they ever called the dump. One of those contractors, eventually, unexpectedly, was Wade Pruitt himself. He showed up at her father's place on a quiet Tuesday morning in 1983, 5 full years after he'd laughed in her face at the mill yard, sitting out in his truck for a good while before he finally worked up the nerve to get out. He'd lost a bid that spring on a restaurant renovation downtown, one that had specifically called for reclaimed heart pine flooring throughout, and he simply hadn't known how to price the work, hadn't known the first thing about resawing old timber safely, or how to keep century-old boards from splitting and cupping once you finally got around to nailing them down properly. He'd lost that bid, plainly and completely, to a 22-year-old woman running her own small crew out of a shop behind her father's house. He found Joe sanding boards in that very same little workshop, standing on the same floor he'd once called rat-chewed junkwood without a second thought. He stood quietly in the doorway for a moment, taking in the neat stacks of sorted lumber lined up along the wall, and finally admitted, plainly, that he genuinely didn't know what he'd been thinking that day. Calling it garbage. Joe didn't rub any of it in. She simply told him that the trouble with calling something garbage is that you stop looking at it closely, and once you stop looking, you never get the chance to learn what it can actually still do. Then she asked, straightforwardly, if he wanted to know how she sourced her wood, how she tested each piece for real soundness before touching a saw to it, how she kept the finished boards from cupping once they were nailed down for good. She spent the better part of that whole afternoon showing him everything, start to finish, exactly the way she would have shown anybody who came to her asking honestly. Pruitt left that evening with a notebook full of his own handwriting and a noticeably different look on his face than the one he'd arrived wearing that morning. In the years that followed, he sent her 11 separate referral jobs he didn't have the specialty himself to handle, and he told anyone who ever asked exactly where he'd learned the method in the first place. A young woman over in Calder's Mill who'd looked at something he was ready to burn and seen real value sitting right there in front of him the whole time. By the time the County Historical Society finally wrote her up in 1985, documenting 7 full years of installations that hadn't cracked, hadn't warped, hadn't once needed a single repair, Jo Calloway wasn't the girl people whispered about at the old mill site anymore. She was the person people called first. The workshop floor is still there today, in Calder's Mill, South Carolina. Heart pine cut from trees that started growing before the Civil War, holding grain from a mill that vibrated through 100 years of spinning frames, resewn and hand-finished by a 17-year-old girl who looked at a burn pile and saw something nobody else around her was willing to see. It isn't something you can buy at any price. It isn't something you can rush, no matter how much money or ambition you bring to it. It's simply the lasting record of what happens when one person refuses to let a thing be called garbage, just because everyone standing around them has already decided that's all it could ever be.